The kerosene lamp flickered across the kitchen table, where John Hartman sat with his wife Martha, counting out $17 in wrinkled bills and worn coins. It was February 1938, and those $17 represented 3 months of cream checks, egg money, and the sale of 2 hogs. Martha had her hand pressed flat against a page torn from the Sears Roebuck catalogue, and John could see her fingers trembling slightly in the yellow lamplight. She was looking at an electric washing machine priced at $39.95. They both knew it might as well have been $1,000. That washing machine was luxury. The kerosene lamp was luxury. The very catalogue itself, ordered special from town, was luxury. And John Hartman was about to make a decision that would change everything his family understood about what luxury meant. In 1938, most American farmers lived in a world that would be unrecognizable to modern eyes. 70% of farm families had no electricity whatsoever. 90% pumped their water by hand from wells or carried it in buckets from springs and creeks. Indoor plumbing existed only in dreams and mail-order catalogs. The concept of luxury had nothing to do with vacation homes or new automobiles. Luxury meant soap that didn't come from rendered hog fat. Luxury meant flour without weevils. Luxury meant shoes without cardboard stuffed in the soles to cover the holes. John pushed back from that table and walked out into the February darkness without his coat. The cold bit through his flannel shirt, but he barely noticed. He was thinking about Martha's hands, red and cracked from hauling water and scrubbing clothes against a washboard every Monday, rain or shine, summer heat or winter freeze. Those hands had been smooth when he married her 12 years ago. Now they looked like his father's hands had looked, worn down by labor that never stopped, never eased, never gave an inch of mercy. The washing machine wasn't luxury. The washing machine was survival. And John Hartman was going to figure out how to buy it, even if it meant going without every other thing they might have called luxury, for the next 2 years. But first, he had to understand what luxury actually meant in his world. The next morning, John hitched up the team and drove into Millerton, the county seat town 5 miles from his farm. The roads were frozen mud, rutted deep from the fall rains, and the wagon jolted so hard his teeth rattled. That 5-mile journey took nearly 2 hours. When he finally reached the hardware store on Main Street, he tied the horses to the hitching post and went inside where the stove was burning, and the air was warm enough to make his ears ache as they thawed. Old man Peterson was behind the counter, and John asked him straight out about electric washing machines. Peterson pulled out his order forms and started talking numbers. The machine itself was $39.95, but that was just the beginning. John would need to run electric lines to his house, which meant contracting with the Rural Electrification Administration if the lines even reached his section, which they didn't yet. He would need to have an electrician come out and wire the house, install outlets, run cable. He would need a water system that could feed the machine, which meant either a cistern with a pump or actual plumbing from a well. Peterson added up the numbers on his notepad, and the final figure came to somewhere between $200 and $300, depending on how the electrical work went. John felt something sink in his chest. $300, he could sell every hog, every chicken, every egg, every pound of butter for a solid year, and not have $300. He could sell the team and the wagon and the plow and the harrow and still come up short. $300 was what some farmers made in a good year, total, before expenses. It was more money than John had ever held in his hands at one time in his entire life. He thanked Peterson and walked back out into the cold, and he stood there on the board sidewalk looking at the few automobiles parked along Main Street, at the electric lights burning in shop windows even in midday, at the water fountain outside the courthouse, where water ran free for anyone who wanted to drink. Luxury. All of it was luxury. And John Hartman lived 5 miles away in what felt like a different century entirely. He drove back home with his mind working over the problem like a dog worrying a bone. Martha was in the kitchen when he came through the door, and she had that look on her face that meant she already knew what he was going to say. He told her about the $300, and she just nodded and went back to peeling potatoes for dinner. They ate in silence that night, the kerosene lamp smoking slightly because the wick needed trimming, and after the dishes were washed, John sat down with a pencil and paper and started making lists. The first list was things they currently had that qualified as luxury by farm standards in 1938. The kerosene lamp itself. They had 3 lamps total, which meant they could light 3 rooms at once if they wanted to burn that much kerosene, which they never did, because kerosene cost money. Luxury. They had a wood-burning cook stove with 6 lids and a warming oven, bought used in 1932, when Martha's old stove finally cracked clean through. That stove had cost $8, and John remembered his father saying it was a sinful waste of money when a Fieldstone fireplace cooked just as well. Luxury. They had a coffee grinder, a hand-cranked mill that could turn whole beans into grounds, and they bought real coffee beans maybe twice a year when the cream checks were good. The rest of the time they drank parched grain that Martha brewed up and called coffee, even though everyone knew it wasn't. Real coffee was luxury beyond measure. They had a catalogue, the Sears Roebuck wish book that showed every item a family could possibly want, from washing machines to tractors to ladies' hats with feathers. The catalogue cost nothing to receive, but looking through it was luxury, because it showed you everything you couldn't have, and somehow that was both painful and precious. Martha would sit with that catalogue on Sunday afternoons and turn the pages slowly, looking at the dresses and the kitchen equipment and the children's shoes, and she never said a word about wanting those things, because wanting was its own form of luxury they couldn't afford. They had a party line telephone, installed just last year when the line finally reached their section. 8 families shared that line, which meant you had to listen for your ring pattern and ignore everyone else's calls, even though everyone listened to everyone else's business anyway. The telephone cost $1 a month, $12 a year, and John had agonized over that expense for weeks before finally agreeing to it. Martha had argued that it was a necessity, not a luxury, because what if someone got hurt or sick and they needed to call for help? John had agreed in the end, but he still thought of that $1 a month as luxury spending. In 1938, $1 could buy 10 pounds of sugar or 20 pounds of flour or 3 gallons of kerosene. $1 was serious money. They had dishes that matched. 12-place settings of plain white ironstone that had been Martha's mother's and before that her grandmother's. Most farm families ate off whatever plates they could scrounge, mix and match pieces from different sets, chipped and cracked and glued back together. Matching dishes were luxury. They had real glass windows in every room instead of oiled paper. They had a feather bed instead of a straw tick. They had 2 changes of clothes apiece instead of 1. By the standards of 1938, John and Martha Hartman were doing fairly well, but Martha's hands were still raw from the washboard, and John could see that rawness spreading up her wrists toward her elbows as the years went by. The second list John made was things other people had that his family didn't. His neighbor Tom Crawford had a tractor, a Farmall regular bought used in 1935, and that tractor could plow in a day what took John 3 days with the team. Crawford was plowing his wheat stubble under while John was still working his first field. Crawford was harrowing and planting while John was still plowing. The tractor cost $600 used, more than twice what the washing machine would cost, and it burned gasoline that had to be bought and hauled and stored. But that tractor meant Crawford could farm twice the acres with half the labor, which meant twice the income, which meant Crawford could afford things like the washing machine his wife already had. The tractor was luxury, except it wasn't luxury at all anymore. It was becoming necessity, and farmers who didn't have tractors were falling behind farmers who did, and the gap was widening every season. The Hendersons down the road had electricity. Their place was on the main county road where the REA lines had reached 2 years ago, and now they had electric lights in every room, an electric iron, an electric pump for their well, and yes, an electric washing machine. John had been in their house once, at night, and he had stood there amazed at how bright the rooms were, how you could just flip a switch and have light that didn't smoke or smell or need its wick trimmed. Mrs. Henderson did her washing on Tuesday mornings now, not Monday, because it didn't matter anymore what day you washed when the machine did most of the work. She hung the clothes on the line by 9 in the morning and had them dry and folded by noon. Martha spent all day Monday washing, and if the weather was bad, she had to hang everything inside where it dripped and made the house cold and damp for days. Electricity was luxury of a magnitude John could barely comprehend. The Martins in town had indoor plumbing. John had used their bathroom once, and the experience had been almost frightening. You pulled a chain and water rushed down and carried everything away to somewhere else. Somewhere you didn't have to think about or deal with or shovel out come spring. The Martins had a bathtub made of porcelain, white and gleaming, with hot water that came from a tap. Martha heated water on the stove for baths, hauling it bucket by bucket, and they all bathed in the same water on Saturday nights. Hottest for the youngest and coolest for whoever went last. Indoor plumbing was luxury so extreme it seemed like something from a foreign country. But John kept coming back to the washing machine. He could live without a tractor for now, could live without electricity, could live without indoor plumbing. But he couldn't watch Martha's hands turn into his father's hands. He couldn't watch her back bend further every year under the weight of water buckets and wet clothes. The washing machine had to come first, even if it meant finding a way to power it without electricity, even if it meant some kind of improvisation that no catalog had ever shown. That's when John remembered his father's old treadmill. It was still out in the equipment shed, rusted and unused for 20 years, but his grandfather had built it in the 1880s to power a grain thresher and a corn sheller. The treadmill was simple engineering, a large wheel connected to a belt and pulley system, powered by a horse or mule walking on a sloped tread. His grandfather had used it before steam engines became common, and then it had been retired and forgotten. But the principle was sound. A rotating wheel could power machinery. A washing machine was just machinery. John spent the next 2 weeks in that equipment shed every spare moment he had, working by lantern light after the chores were done. He took apart the old treadmill, cleaned decades of rust off the gears and bearings, hammered out bent pieces, carved new wooden parts where old ones had rotted away. He studied the washing machine description in the Sears catalog, trying to understand how it worked, what made the agitator move, what turned the wringer rollers. The machine was electric, but the motor just turned a shaft. If he could turn that shaft some other way, the machine would work just fine. Martha watched him work without saying much. She knew better than to ask questions when John got focused on a problem. She brought him coffee in the evenings, real coffee that she somehow scrounged from somewhere, and he drank it hot and sweet with precious sugar and went back to work. The neighbors started hearing about what John was doing, and they came by to watch and offer opinions. Tom Crawford said it wouldn't work, that the machine needed steady power and a horse on a treadmill would never give you that. Old man Peterson from the hardware store drove out one Sunday and said John was crazy, that he should save up for electricity like everyone else. But John kept working. By the end of March, John had the treadmill rebuilt and functional. The big wheel turned smooth when you cranked it by hand, and the belt system was tight and true. Now he needed the washing machine itself. He had $43 saved, which was $4 more than the machine cost. He drove into Millerton on a Tuesday and walked into Peterson's hardware store and ordered the Thor electric washing machine, model number 42, $39.95 plus freight. Peterson filled out the order form and said it would take 6 weeks to arrive from Chicago. John paid cash money, counting out the bills and coins, and walked out of that store feeling like he had just bought a palace. The waiting was hard. Martha didn't say anything, but John could see her looking at the calendar, counting days. She didn't believe the treadmill idea would work, John could tell, but she was hoping anyway. The neighbors kept stopping by to check on progress, and the whole section was talking about crazy John Hartman, who was going to run an electric washing machine with a horse on a treadmill. Some folks thought it was clever. Most folks thought it was foolish. Nobody knew for sure until they tried it. The washing machine arrived on a Friday in early May, shipped by rail to Millerton, and hauled out to the farm on Peterson's truck. It came in a wooden crate with the Thor name branded on the side, and John and Peterson unloaded it carefully in the yard. Martha came out to look, and her face was something John would remember for the rest of his life. She didn't cry, but her eyes got bright and her mouth went soft, and she reached out one rough hand to touch the crate like she was afraid it might disappear. This was luxury. This was impossible luxury right here in their farmyard. And it wouldn't work unless John's crazy plan worked. It took 2 days to set everything up. John ran the belt system from the treadmill in the equipment shed to the back porch where the washing machine would sit. He had to build a connection system to link the machine's drive shaft to his belt pulley, carving pieces by hand and fitting them together with the kind of precision he usually reserved for fixing pocket watches and gun mechanisms. The machine needed water, so he positioned it near the hand pump where Martha could fill it with buckets. It needed to drain, so he ran a hose out to the garden. By Sunday afternoon, everything was ready. The machine sat on the back porch, gleaming white porcelain with chrome trim, looking like something from another world. The belt ran taut from the treadmill wheel to the machine's drive system. Old Nell, their oldest and gentlest mare, stood harnessed and waiting at the treadmill. Martha had Monday's washing ready. She had saved everything for a week, and there were 2 huge piles of dirty clothes waiting, more than she usually washed at once. She wanted to test this machine properly. John filled the washing tub with hot water from the stove, added Martha's homemade soap, and loaded in the first batch of overalls and work shirts. Then he led Nell up onto the treadmill and gave the command to walk. Nell started walking, her hooves steady on the wooden slats, and the big wheel began to turn. The belt started moving, the pulley system engaged, and the washing machine started to agitate. The sound was like music. The agitator swished back and forth, pushing the clothes through the soapy water, and John could see them moving around in there, getting cleaned by nothing more than mechanical action and his ingenuity. Martha stood watching with both hands pressed to her mouth, and when she finally spoke, her voice was shaking. "It works," she said. "John, it works." And John stood there watching old Nell walk her patient circle, powering luxury that was supposed to require electricity they didn't have and probably wouldn't have for years yet. The first washing took 40 minutes. Martha used the wringer to squeeze out the water, cranking the clothes through the rollers by hand, while John kept Nell walking. Then she dumped the wash water, filled the tub again for rinsing, and they did it all over. By noon, everything was washed, rinsed, wrung, and hanging on the line. Work that usually took Martha from dawn until dark was done by lunchtime, and her hands weren't raw and bleeding from the washboard. She stood in the kitchen making dinner, and she kept looking out the window at the washing machine on the porch, and she started crying. John came in from tending to Nell and found Martha crying over the stove, and he didn't know what to say. She turned to him and said, "This is luxury, John. This is real luxury." And he held her there in the kitchen with the spring sunlight coming through the window and the smell of beans and cornbread filling the air. Word spread fast. By Wednesday, half the women in the township had found reasons to visit Martha and see the horse-powered washing machine. They brought eggs or butter or sewing projects, excuses to stop by, and they all wanted to see it work. Martha demonstrated it proudly, and the women stood around watching Nell walk her circle, while the machine swished and churned. Some of them laughed, saying their husbands would never do such a thing. Some of them got very quiet, and you could see them thinking, calculating whether their own husbands might consider it. Mrs. Henderson, who had electricity and an electric washing machine, came out from town to see it, and she said it was the most ingenious thing she had ever witnessed. 2 weeks later, Tom Crawford asked John to help him build a treadmill system for his wife's washing machine because electricity wasn't coming to their section anytime soon, and Crawford had finally noticed that his wife's hands looked like leather. But John was already thinking about the next luxury. He had proven that you could have modern conveniences without electricity if you were willing to improvise and work for it. Now he started looking at other things in that Sears catalog with new eyes. An electric iron could be heated on the stove instead. A cream separator could be powered by the treadmill system. A pump could lift water from the well to a tank in the attic, giving them gravity-fed water pressure, almost like indoor plumbing. Every luxury that people said required electricity or money or things farmers didn't have, John started seeing as a problem with a solution. You just had to figure out what the solution was. By fall, John had added a mechanical cream separator powered by the same treadmill system. Martha could now separate 50 gallons of milk in the time it used to take to separate 10. And the butter and cream were bringing in better money because they could process more volume. The extra income meant they could afford small luxuries that had been impossible before. Martha bought real coffee beans at the store and didn't feel guilty about it. John bought himself a new pair of boots instead of resoling his old ones for the 4th time. They subscribed to the Saturday Evening Post, a magazine that came every week and cost $3 a year, and reading that magazine on Sunday afternoons became a luxury they both looked forward to. The following spring, John built a tower and installed a water tank in their attic. He rigged the treadmill to power a pump that lifted well water up into that tank, and suddenly they had running water in the kitchen. Not hot running water, but cold water that came from a tap instead of a bucket, and that simple change transformed Martha's work. She could fill pots directly from the tap. She could rinse dishes under running water. She could wash vegetables without hauling and carrying. It wasn't the indoor plumbing that town people had, but it was closer than any farm family in the township had ever gotten without electricity. And it was luxury that John had built with his own hands, using materials he had scavenged and rebuilt and reimagined. Other farmers started visiting, not to laugh, but to learn. John showed them his systems, explained how the treadmill worked, helped them understand that modern convenience didn't have to mean modern expense. Some farmers went home and built their own versions. Some decided to wait for electricity after all. But everyone started thinking differently about what luxury meant. It wasn't just something you bought from a catalog. It was something you created by refusing to accept that your family had to live the way families had always lived. Luxury was innovation. Luxury was determination. Luxury was looking at your wife's cracked and bleeding hands and saying, no, there has to be a better way, and then finding that better way through sweat and ingenuity and a refusal to quit. By 1940, John and Martha had things that would have seemed impossible 2 years earlier. They had the washing machine, the cream separator, the running water, and John was working on a mechanical refrigerator that would run on kerosene instead of electricity. Their farm wasn't any bigger than before. They weren't making significantly more money. But Martha's hands were healing. Her back wasn't bent under water buckets, and she had time to do things besides just survive. She started a garden that was 3 times larger than before because she had time to tend it properly. She began canning vegetables and fruits in quantities that filled their cellar with food security they had never known. She even had time to sit on the porch some evenings and read the Saturday Evening Post before the sun went down. And that time to sit and read was luxury beyond any price. John looked at his neighbors and saw them starting to make their own changes. Crawford got his treadmill system working and added a hay elevator powered by the same mechanism. The Hendersons in town, who already had electricity, came out to see John's systems and ended up having him help design a better water tower, because John's engineering was better than what their expensive contractor had installed. Even old man Peterson at the hardware store started stocking parts that John used, because other farmers were coming in asking for the same things. The definition of luxury was changing across the whole township, spreading outward from one stubborn farmer who had refused to accept that his wife had to suffer just because they were poor. But the real luxury, the luxury that mattered most, didn't come from any machine or system or innovation. It came on a Sunday morning in June 1940 when Martha came into the kitchen and made coffee without having to think about whether they could afford it. It came when she sat down at the table with John, and they drank that coffee together while sunlight streamed through clean windows and they could hear their children playing outside without worry or fear. The luxury was time. The luxury was ease. The luxury was the simple fact that their life had become slightly less brutal, slightly less exhausting, slightly less filled with pain that seemed endless and inevitable. John never did get electricity to their farm. The REA lines didn't reach their section until 1947, 2 years after the war ended, and by then John had built so many alternative systems that electricity seemed almost beside the point. They got it anyway, because Martha wanted electric lights and John couldn't build those himself. But the washing machine kept running on the treadmill for another 5 years because it worked perfectly fine and there was no reason to change it. The treadmill system became something of a local landmark, and people would bring visitors out to see crazy John Hartman's horse-powered washing machine, and John would demonstrate it with pride because it represented something that mattered. It represented the refusal to accept poverty as destiny. It represented ingenuity in the face of hardship. It represented love expressed through labor and innovation. In 1938, luxury for farmers meant things that seem almost laughable now. Real coffee instead of parched grain, white flour without bugs, soap that didn't smell like hog fat, a kerosene lamp that didn't smoke, a telephone shared with 7 other families, a washing machine that ran on horsepower because electricity was science fiction. These were the luxuries that farm families dreamed about. saved for, sacrificed to obtain. And John Hartman's washing machine, powered by patient old Nell walking her endless circle, stood as proof that luxury wasn't about money or modern convenience. It was about refusing to accept that things had to stay the way they had always been. It was about looking at a problem and finding a solution even when everyone said there was no solution. It was about understanding that the real luxury was the time and ease and dignity that came from making life slightly less brutal for the people you loved. Thank you for watching this video about what luxury meant to American farmers in 1938. If you found this story interesting, please consider subscribing to our channel, giving this video a like, and sharing it with others who appreciate American agricultural history and the ingenuity of rural communities. This video is inspired by real events and does not aim to represent or offend anyone. John Hartman is a representative character who reflects the real experiences of hundreds of American farmers who faced similar situations during this era, finding creative solutions to improve their families' lives despite economic hardship and limited resources. The innovations described here were common across rural America during the Depression years, as farm families refused to accept that modern convenience was beyond their reach, and instead built their own versions of luxury through determination and engineering skill.